The chisel is bronze. The wall is limestone. The man holding both has a list and a cartouche to match. He positions the blade against the oval frame that circles a pharaoh's name, a name carved into this temple wall less than a generation ago. He strikes. Stone dust falls into the crease between his thumb and forefinger. He strikes again. A flake of limestone drops to the floor, taking a hieroglyph with it. He doesn't know who the pharaoh was. The list doesn't explain. It gives a location, a wall, a row of cartouches, and an instruction: remove. He's done 6 today. By the end of the week, he'll do dozens more. Other masons are doing the same thing across the river, in other temples, in tombs, on obelisks. Whatever this man did, whoever he offended, the order is total. Somewhere south of here, a city stands empty. A city this pharaoh built from nothing, raised on land that had never been dedicated to any god. Temples with no roofs, palaces with no king, walls still covered in a name that, here in Thebes, the masons are already breaking apart. The pharaoh ruled for 17 years. He changed the religion. He moved the capital. He told 3,000 years of tradition that it was wrong, and he was right, and the only god worth worshipping was the one that rose each morning and set each night. Then he died, and within a decade, the men who came after him decided that none of it had ever happened. The mason finishes the cartouche. Where the name was, there is now a shallow rectangular scar, lighter than the surrounding stone, slightly rough at the edges. In a few years, dust and grime will darken it. In a few centuries, sand will cover it entirely. In 3,000 years, someone will clear that sand, find the scar, and begin the long work of figuring out what name had been underneath. They'll find it, not on this wall, but in other places, places the masons couldn't reach, or didn't bother with, or hadn't been told about, in blocks buried inside other men's monuments, in cliffs too remote to climb, in letters written in a language that wasn't Egyptian. The mason doesn't know any of this. He's working. The sun is high and the dust is in his teeth. He has a list and names to break. 2 statues sit at the edge of the floodplain west of Thebes, 18 meters tall, 700 tons each. They depict a seated pharaoh with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the horizon. Behind them, once, stood the largest mortuary temple ever built in Egypt. The temple is gone, dissolved by flood and time, and later pharaohs who stripped it for parts. The statues remain. They've been sitting there for over 3,000 years. The pharaoh they depict is Amenhotep III, and until his son came along, his reign was the high watermark of Egyptian civilization. By the time Amenhotep III took the throne around 1386 BC, the 18th dynasty had been accumulating power for nearly 2 centuries. His predecessors had done the hard work. Thutmose III, 4 generations back, had fought 17 military campaigns and turned Egypt into an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to the banks of the Euphrates in the northeast. Amenhotep III inherited that machine. He didn't need to conquer anything. He just needed to run it, and he ran it beautifully. 38 years on the throne. Luxor Temple, the colonnade hall with its 14 papyrus columns, each one taller than a 2-story building. The palace complex at Malkata on the west bank, with its own harbour large enough for a royal barge. Diplomatic marriages to princesses from Babylonia and Mitanni that cemented alliances along the entire eastern Mediterranean. His court sent and received correspondence with every major power of the late Bronze Age: Assyria, Hatti, Arzawa, Al-Ashir. In one of those letters, a Babylonian king writes to the pharaoh and says the words that define the relationship. "Gold is like dust in your country. Just send it." Egypt did send it. Gold poured out of Nubian mines. It bought alliances, marriages, silence, It funded construction programs that employed tens of thousands. The Amun Temple at Karnak, already the largest religious complex in the world, grew larger under Amenhotep III's patronage. Gift after gift poured into the priesthood, and that was the tension no one talked about. Every building project, every endowment, every festival made the Amun priesthood richer. By the end of Amenhotep III's reign, the high priest of Amun controlled estates, granaries, cattle herds, and a permanent workforce that rivaled the palace itself. The king and the temple were supposed to be partners. Somewhere along the way, the balance had shifted. The throne had made the temple so powerful that it could afford to disagree. Amenhotep III died around 1349 BC. When he did, he left behind the richest kingdom on earth, the most powerful priesthood in Egypt, and a son who would decide that the whole arrangement was wrong. To understand why the sun would eventually burn the system down, you have to understand how the system fed itself. The Amun Temple at Karnak was a working economy. It owned farmland across Egypt, fields that produced grain taxed at rates set by the priesthood, stored in granaries the priesthood controlled, redistributed to a workforce the priesthood employed. The high priest administered cattle herds numbered in the thousands. Foreign tribute flowed through the temple as offerings, and each new pharaoh, by building more monuments to Amun, transferred more land, more labor, and more revenue to the institution he was supposed to oversee. Amenhotep III had built more than any pharaoh before him, and every stone laid at Karnak had made the priesthood wealthier. He noticed. The evidence suggests that Amenhotep III, late in his reign, began hedging against the institution he'd enriched. The Esed festival was the key. This was the ancient Jubilee, a ritual where the pharaoh demonstrated, in front of the court and the gods, that his body was still strong enough to rule. Most pharaohs celebrated it once, at year 30. Amenhotep III celebrated 3, in years 30, 34, and 37. No one else in the 18th dynasty came close. The festival was a performance of direct divine legitimacy. The pharaoh didn't need a priest to intercede on his behalf. He stood before the gods and proved himself. Each said festival said the same thing: I don't need an intermediary. And then there was the barge. Amenhotep III built a pleasure barge for the artificial lake at his Malkata palace. He named it Chiehen Aten. The Aten gleams. The Aten, the visible sun disk, one of 100 solar deities in the Egyptian pantheon, and until now, a minor one. The king was signaling something. He also built a small temple to the Aten at Thebes, modest compared to Karnak, easily overlooked. A chapel beside a cathedral. He never pushed it further. Whatever Amenhotep III thought about Amun, he kept it quiet. He continued building at Karnak. He continued funding the priesthood. He celebrated the old festivals and honored the old gods. He may have seen the imbalance, but he chose to manage it rather than confront it. His son would make a different choice. The throne was never supposed to be his. Amenhotep III's eldest son was Crown Prince Thutmose. He carried the right name, held the right title, High Priest of Ptah at Memphis, and performed the right duties. When his pet cat died, he had it embalmed and buried in a miniature limestone sarcophagus. That sarcophagus still exists. The prince doesn't. He died before his father, and the records don't say when or how. The spare stepped forward. His name was Amenhotep, the fourth pharaoh to carry it. Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied. He took the throne under a name that honored the god he would spend his reign trying to destroy. Almost nothing survives from his life before accession. No childhood inscriptions, no tutors named, no records of education, training, or religious instruction. The man who would attempt the most radical religious transformation in Egyptian history is a blank page until the moment the crown touched his head. We don't know if he was raised in the Aten cult his father had quietly promoted. We don't know if he clashed with the Amun priesthood before he had the power to act on it. We don't know what made him the way he was. Scholars have debated whether he even ruled alone from the start. The co-regency question, whether he shared the throne with his father for some period, has split Egyptologists for decades. A tomb inscription discovered in 2014, belonging to Vizier Amenhotep Hui, shows cartouches of both Amenhotep III and his son side by side. Supporters of a long co-regency say this proves they ruled together for up to 12 years. Opponents point out that Amenhotep III's name was never targeted by the later Erasure campaigns. If he'd been a co-heretic, why would the restorers have spared him? And the two pharaohs are never shown performing the same ritual at the same time, which was the standard iconography for co-regencies in earlier dynasties. The current consensus leans against it. Most Egyptologists favor no co-regency or a very short overlap of a year or two at most. What is certain is this. Around 1353 BC, a young man somewhere between 16 and 20 years old inherited the wealthiest empire on earth, a priesthood that could rival his treasury, and a minor sun god his father had been quietly feeding. Within 5 years, he would abandon the capital, rename himself, and declare war on every god in Egypt except one. For the first 4 years, Egyptian convention held. Amenhotep IV ruled from Thebes. He observed the expected festivals. He worshipped at the expected temples. If anyone at court thought the new king was unusual, no record of that concern survives. What survives are the buildings. East of the main Amun precinct at Karnak, directly adjacent to the temple complex that the priesthood controlled, Amenhotep IV began construction on 2 new temples. The Gemparten, the Aten is found, and the Huat Benben, the house of the Benben, temples to a sun god, raised in the shadow of the god they would eventually replace. The construction method said as much as the dedication. Instead of the massive stone blocks used in traditional Egyptian temple building, Amenhotep IV ordered a new standard, talatat, sandstone blocks cut to roughly 52 by 26 by 24 centimeters and weighing about 70 kilograms. Small enough for one man to carry. A traditional temple block took a team, a talatat took a laborer. The temples went up fast. Whatever Amenhotep IV was building, he was building it in a hurry. And then there were the statues. From the ruins of the Gemparten, archaeologists recovered colossal figures of the king, and they looked like nothing Egypt had produced in 3,000 years. The face stretched and narrowed, the jaw elongated, the lips thickened, the cheekbones angular, the hips widened, the belly swelled, the limbs tapered to spindles. Some scholars have argued these depictions reflect a medical condition. Others say they represent a deliberate theological statement, the pharaoh as both mother and father of his people. The debate continues. What is certain is that the art was a provocation. It was designed to look different. At the Habyuti Ben Ben, another provocation. In some relief scenes, the king's wife, a woman named Nefertiti, appears making offerings to the Aten on her own, no pharaoh beside her, a queen performing priestly ritual alone. That had never happened in Egyptian art. 4 years, 2 temples, a new building method, statues that broke every rule, a queen who worshipped without the king. Nothing had been announced, no proclamation had been issued, no gods had been banned, and already anyone paying attention could see that the system Amenhotep III had carefully managed was being tested by his son in ways the old king had never dared. The 5th year would make it official. Her name meant, "The Beautiful One has come." Her origins are less clear. She was probably the daughter of a courtier named Ai, who would later become Pharaoh himself. She may have grown up in the royal household. She may have been raised alongside the prince she married. The records offer possibilities and little else. What is certain is that by the time Amenhotep IV began his reign, Nefertiti was already beside him, and she would stay there for the next 15 years. They had 6 daughters: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankasampaten, Neferneferuaten, Tasherit, Neferneferura, and Setapenra. 6 daughters, and as far as the evidence shows, no sons. The implications of that gap would shape everything that followed the king's death. In Egyptian art, scale determines rank. A pharaoh is drawn larger than his wife. A queen is drawn larger than her servants. The size of a figure on a wall tells you exactly where that figure stands in the hierarchy. On the boundary stelae that mark the edges of the new capital, the 14 stone tablets where Akhenaten swore his oath, Nefertiti appears at the same scale as the king, same height, same proportion, both standing beneath the rays of the Aten, both receiving the Ankh, the symbol of life, directly from the sun disk. Below them, in smaller scale, the daughters. Above them, nothing. They were the top of the hierarchy, and they were equals. The visual evidence goes further. On Talatat blocks recovered from Karnak, Nefertiti is shown in the classic smiting pose, arm raised, gripping an enemy by the hair, a scene that in 3,000 years of Egyptian art had belonged exclusively to pharaohs. She wears a variant of the kepresh, the blue crown, another emblem that had never appeared on a queen. This was structural. Atenism required 2 intermediaries. The Aten shone on the royal couple. The royal couple reflected that light to the people. Remove one, and the chain broke. Other Egyptian queens had been powerful. Hatshepsut had ruled as pharaoh. Tie, Amenhotep III's wife, had corresponded with foreign kings. Nefertiti's role was different. She was embedded in the theology itself. The religion could not function without her. That made her something Egypt had never quite produced. A queen whose power came from the architecture of the faith rather than from political maneuver. Whatever Amenhotep IV was building, the theology, the temples, the new artistic language, she was part of the blueprint. The 2 of them were about to abandon Thebes, change their names, and start a new city from nothing. When they did, both their names would appear on every boundary stone, every temple wall, every offering scene. Equal scale, equal function. 1 pharaoh and 1 queen, standing between the sun and everything underneath it. In the 5th year of his reign, the king erased his own name. Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied, was the name his father had carried, and his grandfather, and the dynasty's founder before them. It was the name of loyalty, the name that said, the old god is honored, the old order holds, the covenant between the throne and the temple remains intact. The king carved it off his monuments and replaced it with a new one, Akhenaten. Effective for the Aten, 4 syllables, and the covenant was broken. Amun was gone from the royal name for the first time in a century. The god who had sustained the dynasty, whose priests controlled the wealth of Karnak, whose temples lined both banks of the river, removed. Replaced by a sun disk that had, until a generation ago, been a footnote in the Egyptian pantheon. Nefertiti changed her name too. She became Neferneferuaten Nefertiti. Beautiful are the beauties of the Aten. The beautiful one has come. Both of them now carried the Aten in their identities. The old god had been written out of the royal household at the level of grammar. And then the announcement. The king would leave Thebes. He would build a new capital on land that had never been dedicated to any god. Virgin ground, owing nothing to Amun, owing nothing to tradition. He would call it Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten. He would move the court, the administration, the treasury. He would leave Karnak standing, and he would never come back. There is no record of protest, no surviving inscription from a priest of Amun objecting, no petition from a governor, no speech from a courtier urging caution. The silence in the archive is total. This does not mean everyone agreed. It means no one could stop him. He was Pharaoh. In the Egyptian system, the Pharaoh spoke for the gods. If the Pharaoh said the gods had changed, then the gods had changed. The mechanism that gave the Amun priesthood its legitimacy was the same mechanism that allowed the king to dismantle it. The authority was circular, and Akhenaten had just stepped to the center of the circle. He had been on the throne for 5 years. He had built temples inside the Amun precinct. He had married a queen who worshipped alongside him. He had produced statues that shattered the conventions of Egyptian art. And now he was walking away from all of it, from Thebes, from Karnak, from the entire religious infrastructure of the state he ruled, to start again on empty ground. The city he would build there is the subject of a later chapter. What matters here is the act of leaving. Roughly 300 kilometers south of Memphis, the limestone cliffs on the east bank of the Nile pull back from the river and open into a natural bay, a wide, flat stretch of desert framed by rock on 3 sides and the river on the 4th. In the 5th year of Akhenaten's reign, no temple stood here, no village, no shrine to any god. The land belonged to no one. He chose it for exactly that reason. Into the cliffs on both sides of the river, Akhenaten ordered 14 stelae carved, massive stone tablets cut directly into the rock face, some standing over 7 meters tall. They ringed the site like boundary markers because that is precisely what they were. Each carried an inscription. Each carried the same oath. The king swore 3 things. He would build the Aten, a temple, a palace, and a tomb for himself and his family at this site. He would never extend the boundaries beyond the markers, and he would never leave. If he died elsewhere, his body was to be brought back and buried in the tomb he would carve into the eastern cliffs. The oath was dated. It was specific. It named structures. It named tombs. One for the king, one for Nefertiti, one for their eldest daughter. It even named a bull, the Menevis, sacred animal of Heliopolis, the old sun cult city far to the north. The Aten had roots, and Akhenaten wanted those roots carved in stone. The city would be called Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten. What it looked like, how it was laid out, and who lived there belonged to a later chapter. What matters at this point in the story is the oath itself and what it reveals. Akhenaten did not hedge. He did not say, for as long as the gods permit, or unless circumstances change. He carved a permanent commitment into limestone and signed it with his name and the name of his god. The stelae were placed high enough on the cliff face that they could be read from below. They were meant to be seen. They were meant to last. There is no provision for succession, no plan for what happens after his death beyond the location of his burial, no mechanism for the Aten cult to survive the loss of its sole intermediary. Akhenaten built a religion that required his personal presence, and then carved a permanent oath into a cliff, as if permanence and mortality were not a contradiction. He was roughly 25 years old. He had the entire apparatus of an empire at his command. He was about to build a city from nothing, and the first thing he did with the silence of that empty desert was fill it with a promise he could not keep. The men went out with chisels. Akhenaten dispatched agents across Egypt, north to the Delta, south to Nubia, and into every temple precinct between. Their assignment was specific: find the name of Amun and remove it. Wherever the god's name appeared, carved into a temple wall, inscribed on an obelisk, etched into a lintel, they chiseled it out. Not covered, not painted over, cut from the stone, leaving a rectangular scar where the hieroglyphs had been. They started with the temples. Karnak, the complex that the Amun priesthood had spent centuries building into the largest religious site in Egypt, was methodically defaced. The name of its god was gouged from columns, doorways, sanctuary walls. Then they moved to Luxor, then to temples along the Nile that Amenhotep III and his predecessors had built as dedications to Amun. Then they went further. They entered private tombs, the burial chambers of nobles and officials who had died generations earlier, men who had served the crown loyally and been rewarded with decorated tombs, were opened, and the name of Amun was cut from their walls. In some cases, the deceased's own name was altered. If a dead man had been called Amenhotep, the Amen was chiseled away. The dead were renamed to satisfy the living king. The campaign escalated beyond a single god. In some inscriptions, agents erased the plural word for gods, Netjeru. The issue was no longer that Amun was a rival. The issue was that there were other gods at all. Osiris, the god of the dead, was suppressed. For 3,000 years, every Egyptian had expected to stand before Osiris after death and have their heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at. That judgment determined their eternity. Akhenaten eliminated it. The Book of the Dead, the collection of spells that guided the deceased through the underworld, was pulled from tombs and replaced, in some cases, with hymns to the Aten. The old afterlife was dismantled. In its place, the dead were offered only the Aten's light and the king's intercession. If you wanted eternity, you went through Akhenaten. The campaign was thorough. It was also impossible to finish. Egypt was vast. Tombs were everywhere. Some sites were too remote, some inscriptions too high, some surfaces too damaged to work. The men with chisels reached most of what mattered, and they left scars that are still visible 3,000 years later. The rectangular patches on temple walls at Karnak are not damaged from age or weather. They are the precise dimensions of a god's name, removed on the orders of a pharaoh who intended to replace the entire structure of Egyptian belief with a single disk of light. The revolution did not arrive all at once. It tightened in stages, and the stages are traceable through a single piece of evidence, the Aten's own name. Every Egyptian god had a formal title, a string of epithets that defined their nature and their place in the divine order. The Aten was no different. In the early years of Akhenaten's reign, the god's official name read, the living Ra-Horakhti, who rejoices in the horizon, in his name of Shu, who is in the Aten. Horakhti, a form of the falcon god, Horus, merged with Ra. Shu, the god of air and light. The Aten, in its first formal identity, still carried the names of older gods inside it. It was a solar deity built from existing parts. For the first 5 years, the Aten existed alongside the rest of the pantheon. The temples at Karnak went up inside the Amun precinct. Amun's own priests continued to function. The new god was elevated, promoted, given dedicated structures, and the old gods were left standing. This was phase 1, addition, not replacement. Phase 2 began with the name change. When Amenhotep became Akhenaten and the departure from Thebes was announced, the Aten moved from promoted guest to dominant force. Other gods were marginalized, resources were redirected. The priesthoods of Amun, Ptah, Thoth, and the rest saw their income shrink as the crown funneled tribute toward the Aten cult and the construction of the new capital. The old gods were still there, technically. They were being starved. Then came year 9 and phase 3. The Aten's official name was revised. Horakhti was removed. Shu was removed. The new title read, the living Ra, ruler of the 2 horizons, who rejoices in the horizon, in his name of Ra, the Father who returns as the Aten. Every reference to another god had been excised from the Aten's own identity. The Aten now defined itself in terms of itself alone. This was the moment the suppression, already underway in the temples and tombs, became total. The plural word for gods was chiseled out. Osiris was banned. The afterlife he had governed was erased. And the Aten was given its final visual form, a sun disk with radiating beams, each beam ending in a stylized human hand. Some of those hands extended the Ankh, the symbol of life, toward the royal couple. The rest reached down, open-palmed, toward the earth. No face, no falcon head, no human body, no animal form, no cult statue was ever carved. The temples were built without roofs, open to the sky, because the sky was where the god lived. There was nothing to pray to except a circle of light overhead and the two human beings standing beneath it. In 17 years, the Aten had gone from one god among many to the only god, formless, unnamed, except by its own self-reference, unreachable except through a single royal couple who claimed to be the only channel between the disk and the earth. For 3,000 years, Egyptian religion had been distributed. Every town had a temple. Every temple had a priest. Every household had a shrine, a small niche in the wall where a family kept figurines of the gods who protected their children, eased their births, warded off scorpions. You prayed to Bes for your newborn. You prayed to Taweret during labor. You prayed to your local god for the harvest. And when you died, Osiris weighed your heart. And if you had lived well, you continued. Akhenaten dismantled every level of that system. The local temples were closed or defunded. The household gods were banned. The figurines were removed. The priests who had served as intermediaries between the people and the gods were rendered obsolete. The Aten had no use for them. The god had no cult statue to feed, no darkened sanctuary to maintain, no ritual cycle that required a trained clergy. The temples were open-air platforms. The rituals were conducted by the king. The great hymn to the Aten, attributed to Akhenaten himself, made the claim explicit. There is no other who knows you, only your son. One sentence, one claim. The Pharaoh, and only the Pharaoh, knows the Aten. Every prior priest in Egypt had functioned as a specialist, someone trained in the rituals and texts of a specific god. Akhenaten replaced all of them with himself. The Aten shone on him. He reflected the Aten's light to the people. If the people wanted access to the divine, they came to the king. This was a system with a single point of failure. If the god has no other priest and the only intermediary dies, the religion has no mechanism for continuation. The Aten could not be accessed through scripture. There was no scripture beyond the hymn. It could not be accessed through trained clergy. There were none. It could not be accessed through personal devotion. The Aten did not hear personal prayers. The only path to the divine ran through the mind of one man, and that man was mortal. Akhenaten had built a theology that depended entirely on his own continued existence. The god had no face. The religion had no backup plan. The entire apparatus of Egyptian belief, the temples, the priesthoods, the festivals, the afterlife, had been stripped down and rebuilt as a funnel that pointed at one person. When the time came, and it would come, the question would be simple. Remove the person, and what remains? The answer, as the Masons would eventually demonstrate, was almost nothing. The fullest statement of what Akhenaten believed was found in a tomb. The tomb belonged to a courtier who would, decades later, briefly become Pharaoh himself. Into the entrance corridor, someone carved 13 columns of hieroglyphic text, a hymn to the Aten attributed to the king. Scholars call it the Great Hymn. It is the closest thing Atenism produced to scripture, and it is the only extended text that survives describing the theology in the words of its creator. The hymn follows the sun through a single day. At dawn, the Aten rises, and the world comes alive. Trees flower, birds unfold their wings and raise them in praise. Cattle graze, ships sail north and south, fish leap in the river. Every land is in festival, the text says. The Aten's light is the source of all activity. Without it, the world is inert. At dusk, the cycle reverses. Darkness falls. Lions emerge from their dens. Serpents strike. The world without the Aten is a world of danger and stillness. The hymn describes this reversal plainly, not as punishment, simply as absence. When the light goes, life contracts. The hymn then moves beyond Egypt. The Aten, it declares, created all lands and all peoples. It made their languages different. It made their skin different. It gave each nation its own river, a striking claim from a civilization that considered the Nile the center of the world. You have set every man in his place, the hymn reads. You have distinguished them. The Aten makes the chick cry inside the egg. It fills the rivers. It grows the grain. It counts the seasons. It is the universal mechanism, the force that drives everything biological, ecological, seasonal. The scope is total. The Aten doesn't govern one city's harvest or one kingdom's war. It drives the planet. There are no commandments, no rules for living, no ethical demands, no concept of sin, no instructions for reaching an afterlife, no judgment, no reward for the righteous or punishment for the wicked. The hymn asks nothing of the listener except to recognize the Aten as the source of all things and to praise it. It is a hymn of pure description. The sun rises, life follows, the sun sets, life stops. The sun made everyone. The sun sustains everything. The king alone understands this. The end. 200 lines of praise for a God who demands nothing, written by a king who demanded everything. The theology is beautiful. The power structure behind it is absolute. And the text that contains both was carved into the wall of a courtier's tomb in a city that would be abandoned within a generation. Number CH 04.2, the monotheism question. Narration block 4.2. So what was it? One God, universal creator, active suppression of all rivals, exclusive worship enforced by the state. By several definitions, that is monotheism. The Egyptologist James Henry Breasted called Akhenaten the first individual in history and argued that this was the world's first monotheistic religion, 1500 years before the concept appeared anywhere else. For much of the 20th century, that was the consensus. It did not hold. Eric Hornung called it monolatry, the worship of one God without necessarily denying the existence of others. The Aten, even in its purified form, retained traces of older solar theology. Ra was still embedded in the didactic name. The religion did not argue that other gods were false. It simply acted as if they were irrelevant, then erased them. Donald Redford went further. He saw Atenism as a political instrument, a top-down restructuring of power wrapped in theological language. The religion's function, in his reading, was to centralize authority, dismantle priestly rivals, and redirect revenue. Whether the king genuinely believed what he preached was, for Redford, secondary to what the system achieved. Others have used the term henotheism, the worship of one God while accepting the existence of others. That fits the early years, when the Aten stood alongside the pantheon. It stops fitting around year 9, when the agents went out with chisels and the plural word for gods disappeared from the walls. The classification problem is real, because Atenism does not match any existing template cleanly. It resembles Abrahamic monotheism in some respects: one God, universal creator, exclusive worship. and diverges from it in others. The divergences are specific. Atenism had no ethical code. There were no commandments. There was no concept of sin, no action a person could take that offended the Aten. There was no covenant between the god and a people. There was no scripture beyond a single hymn. There was no personal relationship with the divine. You could not pray to the Aten directly, and the afterlife, as the Egyptians had known it for 3,000 years, had been dismantled and replaced with the king's intercession. What remains when you remove those elements is a religion that shares monotheism's exclusivity and scope, and almost none of its ethical content. A god of light without a moral framework. A universal creator with no interest in how people behave. The label matters less than the facts. Scholars will continue to disagree about what to call Atenism. What they agree on is what it did. It imposed exclusive worship of a single formless god, suppressed all alternatives, and funneled every human relationship with the divine through one man. Whether that constitutes monotheism or something else depends on which part of the definition you weigh most heavily. The documentary does not need to resolve the question. The evidence is on the table. The audience can decide. Psalm 104 from the Hebrew Bible praises a creator who stretches out the heavens, waters the mountains, grows the trees, shelters the birds, and returns the world to darkness when the day is done. The lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. The earth is full of the works of the Lord. The great hymn to the Aten praises a creator who fills the rivers, grows the grain, shelters the birds, makes each nation different, and returns the world to danger when the sun sets. The lions emerge from their dens. The earth is alive with the works of the Aten. In 1933, the Egyptologist James Henry Breasted placed the two texts side by side and argued for a direct connection. The parallels are real. Both texts describe a single universal creator responsible for all life. Both follow a day-night cycle. Light brings safety and abundance. Darkness brings danger and stillness. Both describe the creator providing water to all creatures and sustaining plant and animal life across the earth. Both are hymns of praise with no ethical demands within the text itself. The question is whether the similarity reflects influence or coincidence. Breasted believed in direct influence, that the great hymn, or the tradition it represented, reached the Israelites and shaped their own praise literature. Miriam Lichtheim, in her anthology of Egyptian literature, acknowledged the echoes, but argued that both texts draw from a shared Near Eastern tradition of solar hymns. The parallels, in her view, are generic. Any hymn praising a universal creator would cover similar ground. Others have argued there is no connection at all. Two cultures, 1,500 kilometers and several centuries apart, independently composed praise for the sun. Each position has evidence. None has proof. The gap between the texts is the central obstacle. The great hymn was composed around 1340 BC. Psalm 104 dates, by most scholarly estimates, to somewhere between the 10th and 6th centuries BC, a minimum separation of 300 years. No intermediary text has been found. No document from the intervening period shows the great hymn being copied, transmitted, or adapted. If the hymn influenced the psalm, the mechanism is missing. There is one more difference worth noting. Psalm 104 exists inside a tradition, the Hebrew Psalter, part of a scripture that includes commandments, covenant, and law. The great hymn exists alone. It is the only extended text of Atenism. Psalm 104 is a single thread in a vast fabric. The great hymn is the entire fabric, and there is nothing else on the loom. Whether the thread was borrowed from Egypt or woven independently is a question the evidence cannot currently answer. What it can establish is simpler. 33 centuries ago, a king in the Nile Valley composed a hymn to the sun that praised a universal creator in terms that would not sound foreign in a synagogue, a church, or a mosque. That the words survived at all is remarkable. That they echo in a later scripture is, at minimum, interesting. 4 years. That is roughly how long it took to build a capital city from nothing. The site Akhenaten had chosen, the empty stretch of East Bank desert where he carved his boundary stelae, became Akhenaten, 13 kilometers of urban infrastructure running north-south along the Nile. At its peak, somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people lived there. It had temples, palaces, residential districts, workshops, administrative buildings, military barracks, and a road system planned from scratch. Every structure rose on land where, a decade earlier, there had been sand and rock and silence. The Great Aten Temple was the centerpiece, and it was unlike any temple Egypt had produced in 3,000 years. Traditional Egyptian temples were designed as journeys inward. You entered through a sunlit courtyard, moved through a hypostyle hall where the ceiling dropped and the columns thickened, and eventually reached the inner sanctum, a small, dark room accessible only to the high priest. The deeper you went, the darker it got. The holiest space was the most hidden. Akhenaten reversed the entire sequence. The Great Aten Temple was approximately 730 meters long, nearly 3/4 of a kilometer of open ground. The offering area consisted of hundreds of mud brick tables, arranged in open courtyards under direct sunlight. The priests, and by this point the only functioning priest was the king, made their offerings exposed to the sky. The god was overhead. The ceiling was the atmosphere. There was nothing to enter, nothing to unveil, nothing hidden. The temple's architecture was the theology written in stone. The Aten was visible, and it demanded no intermediary except the man who walked among the offering tables. The small Aten temple stood nearby, a more intimate royal chapel, serving the same open-air principle on a smaller scale. West of the temples, the Great Royal Palace occupied a large compound on the opposite side of the Royal Road, the city's central north-south artery, straight and wide, built for royal processions. The palace held painted floors, columned halls, and a window of appearances where the king stood to distribute gold collars and rewards to loyal officials, while the population watched from below. Directly across the road stood the king's house, the administrative center. The two buildings, palace and house, were connected by an elevated bridge spanning the royal road. The bridge itself contained a window of appearances. The king could cross from his residence to his ceremonial palace overhead, visible to everyone moving along the road beneath. The bridge made the connection between administrative and religious authority literal. You could stand on the royal road and watch the pharaoh walk above you. The city extended in both directions. To the North Palace, a large walled compound decorated with vivid painted scenes of marshland birds and plants, may have served as a residence for a queen or princess. To the south, the Maru Aten held pools, gardens, and painted pavilions. Its inscriptions originally named Kia, Akhenaten's secondary wife. Later, her name was erased and replaced with Meritaten's, the eldest daughter stepping into a role that had been vacated. Between these edges, the residential districts filled in the middle ground. Houses for officials, estates for the elite, workshops for artisans, and, further out, walled off from the rest, a settlement where the workers who built all of it lived. Their story belongs to a later chapter. For now, the city is the one Akhenaten intended the world to see, a statement in stone and sunlight that a single visible god was enough, and that everything else, the dark sanctuaries, the hidden statues, the secret rituals, was no longer necessary. For 3,000 years, Egyptian kings had been depicted the same way. Broad shoulders, muscled arms, 1 foot forward, idealized proportions, symmetrical features arranged in a face of divine composure. The pharaoh as he should be, permanent, powerful, perfect. The pharaoh as he actually looked was irrelevant. The portraits from Karnak, the ones the audience has already seen, were only the beginning. The early Amarna style was extreme, proportions that were neither conventionally male nor female, forms designed to provoke. Most scholars now read these images as a theological program, the king as both mother and father, the creator who encompassed all physical forms in a single body. But around year 8, the style shifted. The extreme elongation retreated. The proportions moved closer to traditional Egyptian norms, though the faces remained more individualized than anything in prior royal art. The bodies became less strange. The intimacy did not. That intimacy was the second revolution. Egyptian pharaohs had never been shown in domestic scenes. They strode, they smote, they made offerings. They appeared in formal poses designed to project divine authority. What they did not do, ever, in 3,000 years of royal art, was kiss their wives, hold their daughters on their laps, or sit side by side in a chariot with the queen while children climbed over them. Akhenaten's art showed all of it. Royal stelae depicted the couple kissing on the lips. Tomb reliefs showed them playing with their daughters under the rays of the Aten. One scene showed them together over the body of their dead daughter, Akhenaten, grieving, in public art, as parents. This had never been seen before. It would never be seen again in Egyptian art after the Amarna period ended. The artist behind the most famous of these images was a sculptor named Thutmose. His workshop, excavated in 1912 by Ludwig Borchardt, was a house in the southern suburbs of Amarna. Inside were portrait busts in various stages of completion, rough forms, plaster casts, half-finished faces. Among them was a single painted limestone bust, approximately 47 centimeters tall, wearing a flat-topped blue crown with a painted headband. The face was Nefertiti's. The surface was polychrome, skin a warm yellow-brown, lips darkened, brows defined, the crown a vivid Egyptian blue. The right eye was inlaid with rock crystal and a wax pupil. The left eye was empty. The socket was carved, the space prepared, the iris never placed. Whether this was a deliberate artistic choice, an accident of the workshop's abandonment, or a sign that the bust was a sculptor's model, a model buste, used as a reference, never intended for display, is still debated. What is certain is that the bust of Nefertiti is now the most recognized single artifact from ancient Egypt. It sits in the Neues Museum in Berlin, where it has been since Borchardt brought it out of the desert in a crate. The face of the queen who helped build this city became the face the world remembers it by. The depictions raised an obvious question. Did Akhenaten actually look like that? If the art was a portrait, then the king had a profoundly unusual body. Over the past century, several medical conditions have been proposed. Marfan syndrome was among the first suggestions. It is a connective tissue disorder that produces elongated limbs and facial features, and it is consistent with parts of the artistic record. It does not cause infertility, which makes it compatible with Akhenaten's 6 known daughters. It also cannot be diagnosed from art alone, and has never been confirmed through genetic testing of any mummy linked to the king. Froelich syndrome, an endocrine disorder that produces obesity and underdeveloped reproductive organs, was proposed early and dismissed early. It causes infertility. Akhenaten fathered at least 6 children with Nefertiti, and possibly more with Kia. The diagnosis is incompatible with his reproductive record. Klinefelter syndrome, a chromosomal condition that can produce wide hips and breast development, was dismissed on the same grounds. A man with multiple confirmed children is an unlikely candidate for a condition defined in part by reduced fertility. The most detailed medical model came from Erwin Braverman, a dermatologist at Yale, who proposed in 2009 that Akhenaten suffered from two conditions simultaneously: craniosynostosis, premature fusion of the skull bones, producing an elongated head, combined with aromatase excess syndrome, which causes overproduction of estrogen and can result in wide hips, breast tissue, and feminized body proportions. The combination would explain the full range of features visible in the early art: the long skull, the soft torso, the wide thighs, the narrow shoulders. It is the most complete attempt to match a medical diagnosis to the artistic evidence. It also rests on the same assumption as every other theory, that the art is telling the truth about the body. CT scans of the mummy, most likely identified as Akhenaten, the body from tomb K555 in the Valley of the Kings, confirmed as Tutankhamun's father by a 2010 DNA study, show a skull within normal parameters. No elongation, no cranial deformation, no skeletal evidence of Marfan syndrome or any connective tissue disorder. The physical remains, to the extent that they can be examined, do not match the art. The dominant view among Egyptologists is that the art was never a portrait. The early Amarna style was a theological program designed to present the king as something beyond male or female, a body that argued rather than described. The colossal statues were a statement about what the king represented, not a record of what the king looked like. The art was radical. The man behind it may have been entirely ordinary. Every theory that tries to diagnose him from his statues begins by assuming the statues are honest. Most scholars now believe the statues were making an argument, and arguments are not obliged to be accurate. There was another wife. Her title, roughly translated, was the favorite. Kia appears in the Amarna record as a secondary queen, less prominent than Nefertiti, but prominent enough to have her own sunshade temple and to be named in the inscriptions at the Maru Aten, the pleasure complex in the city's south. Some scholars have identified her as Tadukipa, the Mitanni princess sent to Egypt as a diplomatic bride for Amenhotep III, who may have been inherited by his son. The identification is speculative. What is certain is that Kia held a title given to no other woman in the Egyptian record, and that for at least several years she was visible enough in official art and architecture to indicate that she mattered. After approximately year 11 or 12, she stopped mattering. Her name was chiseled from the Maru Aten and replaced with Meritaten's, Akhenaten's eldest daughter. Her images were altered or removed. Her cartouches were overwritten. The same machinery that had erased Amun from the walls of Karnak was turned inward, applied to a woman inside the royal family. Whatever happened to Kia, whether she died, fell from favor, or was deliberately removed, the record of her existence was treated the same way Akhenaten had treated the names of the old gods, as something that needed to disappear. She left one physical trace that survived, though it was not found where she was expected. In tomb KV55, in the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists discovered a gilded wooden coffin that had originally been made for a woman. The inscriptions and iconography marked it as a queen's burial. The gold face mask had been ripped away. The cartouches had been altered. Inside was the body of a man, most likely Akhenaten himself, though the identification remains debated. Canopic jars found nearby also bore Kia's partially erased inscriptions. A woman's burial goods, repurposed for a man's body, in a tomb that someone had deliberately damaged before sealing. For years, scholars assumed Kia was the mother of Tutankhamun. A 2010 DNA study ended that hypothesis. Tutankhamun's mother was identified as the mummy known as the KV35 younger lady, genetically Akhenaten's full sister. Kia was neither the mother of the boy king nor, as far as the evidence shows, the mother of any surviving heir. The succession was now in a position that the sole intermediary doctrine could not survive. The system he had built required exactly one thing to continue: a male heir who could stand between the Aten and the people, the way Akhenaten stood. Daughters could hold power, and at least one would, but the theological architecture demanded a son. The man who had redesigned an entire civilization around himself had produced no one to inherit it. By the time the last subchapter of this city's story is told, the building is finished, the art is on the walls, the theology is carved in stone, and the founder has no successor. Everything that follows, the deaths, the reversals, the erasure, flows from this single structural fact. The system had one point of failure, and the failure was already in motion. Further out from the city, past the residential estates and the artisan workshops, walled off from the main settlement, there was a compound. It sat in the desert margin, roughly a kilometer east of the districts where the officials and elites lived. 72 houses, mud brick, arranged on a grid. Each house was approximately the same size. Each had the same layout. There were no estates here, no gardens, no painted floors. The compound was enclosed by a wall, and the only entrance was controlled. There was no well. Water had to be carried in from the main city every day, a kilometer across open desert, every morning, before the work began. These were the people who built Akhenaten, the temples, the palaces, the royal road, the offering tables, every structure the audience has just seen. They lived in standardized housing behind a wall in the desert and drank water someone else carried to them. The work itself was measured in stone. The Talatat blocks went up fast. The city was 13 kilometers long and was substantially built in 4 years. Every temple column, every palace wall, every offering table in the great Aten temple's 700-meter expanse was assembled from these blocks, and someone had to move every one of them by hand. The pace was relentless. Akhenaten was not a monument built over generations, the way Karnak had grown across centuries. It was an entire capital city, erected from the desert floor within a single reign's early years. That speed required labor at a scale and intensity that the standardized housing and walled compounds suggest was not voluntary. The workers built paradise. They did not live in it. Some scholars have noted that walled workers' villages were not unique to Amarna. Deir el-Medina, the artisan settlement at Thebes where the Valley of the King's tombs were carved, was also enclosed. The comparison is fair, but the scale is different. Deir el-Medina housed a specialized workforce building tombs over centuries. Amarna's workers' village housed a labor force that built an entire city from nothing in under 5 years. The volume of work per person, per year, was not comparable. What the work did to their bodies is visible in the ground where they were buried. The bones are the next chapter. The cemetery was in the desert east of the city, not far from the workers' village. Over the past 2 decades, archaeologists from the Amarna project, led by Barry Kemp, and with bioarchaeological analysis by Gretchen Dabbs, Jerome Rose, and Anna Stevens, have excavated hundreds of burials from the South Tomb Cemetery. Most of the dead were non-elite. Many were young. What their skeletons showed was consistent, and it was severe. 75% of adults had osteoarthritis in their limbs or spine. 67% had at least one healed or healing fracture. Vertebrae showed compression and Schmall's nodes, damage consistent with repeated heavy lifting, the kind caused by carrying loads on the back or head day after day. The pattern was not random. It tracked the kind of work the city demanded: continuous, load-bearing, physical. Children as young as 7 showed degenerative joint disease, conditions found in their spines and major joints that are not normally seen until adulthood. The implication is direct. These children were performing heavy labor at an age when their skeletons were still forming. The work did not wait for them to grow. The teeth told a parallel story. Linear enamel hypoplasia, grooves in the tooth enamel, indicated repeated periods of nutritional stress during childhood. Markers of scurvy appeared in the bones. evidence of chronic vitamin C deficiency. Rickets, caused by inadequate vitamin D, appeared in a population that lived under the Egyptian sun, suggesting either severe dietary deficiency or prolonged indoor confinement during formative years. Folic acid deficiency was present. 23% of adult skulls showed cribra orbitalia, porosity of the orbital roof, a sign of chronic anemia from iron deficiency or parasitic infection. 45% of subadults, children and adolescents, showed skeletal stress markers of one kind or another. Their diet, reconstructed through dental wear and isotopic analysis, was bread and beer. Emmer wheat bread, often gritty enough to grind down the teeth over a lifetime. Barley beer, limited animal protein, the staples of Egyptian subsistence without the supplements that came with higher status. In the elite tombs at Amarna, a few hundred meters from where these bodies were buried, the painted walls show a different world. Officials receiving gold collars from the king, banqueting tables heavy with food, processions, celebrations, abundance. These are the images that survived in the decorated tombs, the official version of life at Akhenaten, the one designed to last. The bones beneath the sand tell a different story. 75% arthritis, 67% fractures, children with old men's spines, teeth worn flat by gritty bread, skulls pitted by anemia. This was the city that the hymns praised and the temples celebrated. This was what it cost to build it. It happened inside the city, inside the very compound where the workers lived, in the same settlement where the wall controlled access and the water was carried in and the talatat blocks were lifted and set. In that place, archaeologists found figurines of the old gods, Bes, Taweret, the same household gods Akhenaten had banned, tucked into the corners of houses built to serve the Aten. The gods of the bedroom and the birthing stool, kept close because a pregnant woman believed they would keep her child alive. The Aten offered no such protection. The Aten did not enter the house. The Aten did not care whether your child survived the night. Alongside the figurines, archaeologists recovered amulets depicting traditional deities, small enough to wear, small enough to hide. And in the workers' village itself, they found something more direct. Votive stelae carved with ears of Amun. The practice was standard across Egypt. You carved ears onto a stone to ensure the god could hear your prayers. These stelae were dedicated to the specific god whose name had been chiseled off every temple wall, every obelisk, every private tomb across the country. The workers who were building the Aten city were praying to the god the Aten was supposed to have replaced. A small chapel found in or near the workers' compound contained traditional religious imagery, objects and scenes associated with the old cult practices present inside the controlled settlement. State religion and lived religion were two different things. Akhenaten had changed the official apparatus, the temples, the priesthood, the hymns, the names on the walls. He had dispatched agents to erase Amun from every surface they could reach. He had replaced the Book of the Dead with hymns to the Aten. He had positioned himself as the sole route to the divine and built an entire city to prove it. None of it reached the household. None of it entered the birthing room. None of it replaced the figurine a woman held against her belly in the dark. The revolution controlled the state. It never controlled the people. When, a generation later, the old cults were formally restored, the restoration was not a resurrection. The gods had never died. They had been pushed from official view, removed from temple walls and royal decrees. In the houses, in the private spaces, in the small acts of devotion that no agent could monitor and no decree could reach, Amun had never left. Tutankhamun's restoration. Stella described a land where the temples had fallen into neglect and the gods had turned away. The stela was describing the state. The people had never turned away from anything. In 1887, a woman digging in the ruins near Amarna found clay tablets. They were small, covered in wedge-shaped script, and initially dismissed. By the time scholars recognized what they were, some had already been damaged or lost. What survived, 382 tablets, written almost entirely in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the Late Bronze Age, turned out to be the oldest known archive of international correspondence. The tablets contained two kinds of letters. The first were exchanges between equals, the kings of Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and Hatti, writing to each other as brother, negotiating marriages, exchanging gifts, and occasionally complaining about protocol. This was diplomacy between the five great powers of the 14th century BC, careful, formal, and transactional. The second kind were the vassal letters. These came from the rulers of city-states across Canaan and the Levant, men who owed their positions to Egypt and depended on Egyptian military support to keep them. These letters were pleas. Rib-Hadda, the ruler of Byblos, wrote approximately 60 of them. Each was more urgent than the last. In his early letters, he reported that Abdi-Ashurta, the ruler of the neighboring kingdom of Amurru, was expanding and threatening Byblos's territory. He asked for troops. He asked for archers. He asked for anything. As the months passed and no help arrived, his tone shifted from diplomatic request to open desperation. His allies were defecting to Amurru. His own citizens were turning against him. He was losing cities one by one. When Abdi-Ashurta was killed, his son Aziru continued the campaign. Rib-Hadda continued writing. The archive records his progressive isolation, territory shrinking, allies gone, the Egyptian garrison absent. Eventually, Rib-Hadda was overthrown. His final letters go unanswered in the archive. What happened to him afterward is unknown. He was not the only one writing. Letters from other vassal rulers across the Levant describe similar pressures, threats from neighbors, requests for military support, accusations against rival city-states, appeals to the pharaoh's authority. The archive captures a network of small states under stress, each looking to Egypt for protection and, by the evidence preserved in the tablets, receiving very little in return. The standard reading of the Amarna letters is straightforward. Akhenaten, absorbed by his religious revolution, building his new city, rewriting Egypt's theology, simply did not engage with the diplomatic and military demands of his empire. The letters arrived. The responses, if they were sent, did not produce results visible in the record. Byblos fell. Amurru defected to the Hittites. The kingdom of Mitanni, Egypt's key northern ally, was conquered by the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I. Whether Akhenaten noticed or cared is unknowable. What the letters document is what the vassals experienced: silence. That is the standard reading. It is not the only one. The vassal letters are not neutral documents. The men who wrote them operated within a system where exaggeration was a strategy, not a failure. A ruler who described his city as on the verge of collapse was more likely to receive Egyptian troops, grain, or diplomatic support than one who reported that things were stable. The language of crisis was structural. It was how the system extracted resources from the center. Every vassal had an incentive to sound as desperate as possible, and many of them did. This matters because the same archive contains letters from the reign of Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, the king who presided over what most scholars consider the zenith of Egyptian imperial power. The vassal correspondence from his reign contains similar complaints, threats from neighbors, pleas for military support, accusations of abandonment. If these letters existed under a pharaoh who was demonstrably in control of his empire, then the same language under Akhenaten cannot, by itself, prove that the empire was collapsing. The tone was a feature of the correspondence, not a diagnosis of the state. The Hittite expansion is harder to dismiss. Suppiluliuma I did conquer Mitanni. Egypt did lose its primary northern buffer state. The power balance of the late Bronze Age did shift permanently. These are not matters of interpretation, they happened. The question is whether a different pharaoh could have prevented them. Mitanni's collapse was driven by internal dynastic conflicts and by the Hittite military's superior organization. Egypt had diplomatic ties to Mitanni, including royal marriages, and the fall of the kingdom was a blow to Egyptian interests across the Levant. Whether Egyptian military intervention would have saved Mitanni or merely delayed its fall is debated. What is clear is that the geopolitical shift was not the work of one disengaged pharaoh. It was a structural realignment of power across the entire Near East, driven by Hittite ambition and Mitanni weakness. The honest conclusion is that the Amarna letters do not settle the question. They document vassal anxiety, and vassal anxiety was chronic and performative under every reign. They coincide with a genuine geopolitical crisis, the rise of the Hittites, that may or may not have been worsened by Egyptian inaction. Akhenaten may have been negligent. He may also have been facing a situation that no amount of engagement could have resolved. The archive preserves the complaints. It does not preserve the replies, the policy discussions, or the strategic calculations that may have occurred at the Egyptian court. What it does preserve is a record of a world in which the old certainties, Egypt's dominance, its vassals' loyalty, its alliances' permanence, were being tested. Whether Akhenaten was the cause of that test, or merely its bystander, is a question the tablets raise and do not answer. After a pharaoh died, an Egyptian queen wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I. The letter, preserved in Hittite annals, reads, "My husband has died. I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons, and he might become my husband. I would not want to take one of my subjects as a husband. I am afraid." No Egyptian queen had ever written such a letter. Egypt sent princesses abroad in diplomatic marriages and received foreign brides. The reverse, inviting a foreign prince to become pharaoh, was without precedent in 3,000 years of royal protocol. The fact that a queen wrote it at all was evidence that whoever controlled the Egyptian court at that moment was desperate enough to break every convention the institution had ever maintained. Suppiluliuma did not believe it. He reportedly said that nothing like this had ever happened in his lifetime. He sent an envoy to Egypt to investigate, to confirm that the offer was genuine and that the queen had the authority to make it. The investigation apparently satisfied him. He agreed. He sent his son, Prince Zananza. Zananza was killed on the way. He died crossing the border into Egypt, or shortly after. The Hittite sources blame the Egyptian court. Who ordered the killing is unknown. Theories have pointed to the military commander Horemheb, to the courtier Ai, to elements of the palace establishment who saw a Hittite pharaoh as an existential threat to their positions. Whatever the motive, the consequences were immediate. The Hittites launched military campaigns against Egyptian territories in the Levant. The prisoners captured during those campaigns would later be blamed for the plague that devastated the Hittite Empire for 20 years. The queen's identity is debated. In the Hittite text, the dead pharaoh is called Nibhururiya. Most scholars read this as a rendering of Nebkheperura, the prenomen of Tutankhamun. If so, the queen was Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's widow, and Akhenaten's third daughter. A smaller number of scholars have argued that the name could correspond to Nefertiti's prenomen as Pharaoh, placing the letter after Akhenaten's death rather than Tutankhamun's. The question is unresolved. What is beyond dispute is the letter itself. A queen of Egypt, writing to a foreign enemy, asking for a prince because she had no son, no heir, and no alternative she was willing to accept. The system had reached the point where its own queen saw a Hittite marriage as preferable to whatever awaited her at home. That is what the Amarna period produced. After year 12, the record thins. The early years of Akhenaten's reign produced inscriptions, building projects, diplomatic correspondence, dated events, a dense, traceable archive. The final 5 years produce far less. What survives is fragmentary, often undated, and open to competing interpretations. The reign that generated one of the most detailed records of any Egyptian pharaoh goes quiet in its final act. The deaths had already begun, the cluster of royal losses documented in the bones and the tombs. What followed was a court losing members without replacing them. Kia had been erased. Daughters had disappeared. Queen Tia was likely dead. And Nefertiti, the most visible queen in Egyptian history, became harder to trace. She did not vanish entirely. A graffito from the Aswan quarries, dated to year 16, names her with her full title, Great Royal Wife. 1 year before Akhenaten's death, she was alive and still held the highest queenly rank in Egypt. Whatever happened to her after year 12 was not a fall from power. It was something else, something the surviving record does not explain. During these same years, a figure named Smenkhkare appears. His origins are unclear. The current leading theory, advanced by Aidan Dodson of the University of Bristol, identifies him as a separate male individual, possibly Akhenaten's brother or half-brother, who served briefly as co-regent. Earlier scholars suggested he was Nefertiti under a different name, but this is now a minority position. Smenkhkare's reign, if it can be called that, was brief. He appears, and then the record moves on. Akhenaten died around year 17. There is no evidence of murder. No text describes his death. No intact burial has been confidently identified. The royal tomb at Amarna was prepared for him, but it was disturbed in antiquity, and the remains found in the Valley of the King's tomb, K555, are now thought by most scholars to be his, based on the genetic evidence discussed earlier. The circumstances of his burial remain confused. What is clear is what he left behind. No designated heir, no succession plan, no mechanism for transferring power. He had spent 17 years rebuilding Egypt's theology, relocating its capital, reorganizing its priesthood, and positioning himself as the sole link between humanity and the divine. He had not prepared for the possibility that he would die. The revolution had no second act. It had only its architect, and now he was gone. Someone ruled after Akhenaten. The evidence is clear on this. A pharaoh named Nefertiti held the throne for approximately 2 years between Akhenaten's death and the accession of the boy who would become Tutankhamun. The praenomen, the throne name, was Ankheperura, and it carried a feminine grammatical marker. The ruler was female. The leading current theory identifies her as Nefertiti. The case is built on converging evidence. At Amarna, Nefertiti had been progressively elevated beyond the traditional role of a queen. She had been depicted in pharaonic crowns and performing acts reserved for the king, the smiting scenes and solo offerings the audience saw earlier. By the later years of the reign, her public role was closer to co-regent than consort. The year 16 inscription confirmed she was still alive and titled as Great Royal Wife. 1 year later, Akhenaten was dead. The throne name Nefertiti appears in the record immediately after, with a feminine marker and the epithet effective for her husband. If the name belongs to Nefertiti, then the woman who had been elevated to near pharaonic status during Akhenaten's life assumed the throne after his death. The transition was not a rupture, it was a continuation. There is evidence that during this brief reign, elements of the old religion began to be restored. Texts and graffiti from the period contain references to Amun, references that would have been unthinkable under Akhenaten's full Atenist orthodoxy. If Nefertiti was Nefertiti, then the person closest to Akhenaten, The woman who stood beside him in every temple scene, who worshipped the Aten at his side for 17 years, was the first to begin reversing his revolution. The evidence is suggestive. It is not conclusive. The identification of Nefertiti with Nefertiti is the leading position among current scholars, but it remains a theory supported by circumstantial evidence, converging indicators, rather than a definitive inscription. What can be said is that a female pharaoh ruled Egypt after Akhenaten, that she began restoring what he had dismantled, and that her reign lasted only long enough to start the process before a child inherited the throne. If the theory is correct, then the woman whose painted limestone bust is the most recognized artifact in Egyptology was also one of ancient Egypt's female pharaohs. The bust was made during her husband's reign. The crown was worn after it. The child who inherited the throne was born Tutankhamun, the living image of the Aten. He was approximately 8 to 10 years old when he became pharaoh. One of his first official acts was to change his name. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The name change was a declaration. The Aten was being set aside. Amun was returning. Genetic testing confirmed what scholars had long suspected about his parentage. His father was Akhenaten. His mother was Akhenaten's full sister, a daughter of the same mother and father. Tutankhamun was the product of a brother-sister union, and the physical consequences were written across his skeleton. CT scanning revealed a severe clubfoot in his left leg, talipes equinovarus, which would have made walking painful and unassisted movement difficult. Over 100 walking sticks were found in his tomb. He also suffered from choler disease, a condition in which bone tissue in the foot dies due to interrupted blood supply. DNA testing identified Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest strain of malaria, in his remains, with evidence of multiple infections over time. This was a young man who had been physically compromised from birth, carrying the accumulated damage of royal inbreeding into a role that demanded the appearance of divine authority. He was guided by two men, an elderly courtier who may have been Nefertiti's father, and Horemheb, the commander of the army. The policies enacted under Tutankhamun's name, including the restoration of the old gods, were almost certainly theirs. The restoration stela, erected at Karnak, described the state of Egypt when Tutankhamun came to the throne. The temples had fallen into neglect. Their shrines were desolate. Their compounds had become overgrown paths. The gods had turned their backs on the land. This was the official acknowledgement, drafted by the men who now controlled the state, that Akhenaten's revolution had damaged the religious infrastructure of Egypt so severely that it required a formal program of repair. Tutankhamun died at approximately 18 or 19 years of age. A severe fracture of his left femur, combined with his chronic malaria infections and pre-existing bone disease, may have contributed to his death. No evidence supports the earlier theory that he was murdered. His tomb, K562, discovered by Howard Carter in November 1922, was small by royal standards. It may have been intended for someone else and repurposed in haste. It contained approximately 5,000 objects. It was the only substantially intact royal burial ever found in Egypt. The boy who ruled for a decade left almost no mark on the political record. His fame is entirely the product of what was sealed inside a chamber in the Valley of the Kings and opened 33 centuries later. Tutankhamun died without an heir. Who had guided the boy king through his reign, claimed the succession the way Egyptian protocol allowed. He performed the opening of the mouth ceremony at Tutankhamun's funeral, the ritual act of the heir, administered to the body of the dead king. The ceremony made the claim. The throne passed to an elderly courtier in his 70s, possibly the father of Nefertiti, who had spent decades as the most powerful official below the pharaoh and now became the pharaoh himself. He reigned for approximately 4 years. He left little mark and was himself subsequently erased. Horemheb succeeded him. He was not a member of the royal family. He had no blood claim to the throne, no lineage traceable to any pharaoh. He was the commander of the army, the most powerful military figure in Egypt, and he had spent the reigns of Tutankhamun and I accumulating influence and waiting. His legitimacy came from two sources: the backing of the Amun priesthood, which had been restored to power after Akhenaten's revolution, and a marriage to Mut-Nejmet, a woman believed by some scholars to be Nefertiti's sister. The connection was thin. The military authority behind it was not. Once in power, Horemheb did something that pharaohs had done before, but rarely with such thoroughness. He erased his predecessors. The targets were 5: Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, and I. Their names were chiseled from temple walls and monument inscriptions. Their figures were hacked from reliefs. Their cartouches were recarved with Horemheb's name or left blank. In the official king lists compiled at Abydos and Saqqara, the formal records of legitimate pharaohs maintained for religious and administrative purposes, the succession runs from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb. 5 reigns, spanning approximately 17 years, were removed from the historical record. Horemheb formalized this with a dating decision. He calculated his own regnal years from the death of Amenhotep III. In official documents, the reigns of Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, and I did not exist. They were absorbed into Horemheb's total. The Amarna period, the revolution, the city, the theology, the art, the diplomatic collapse, the deaths, was treated as administrative blank space. In later texts, Akhenaten is never named. He is called the rebel or the criminal of Akhenaten. To name him was to acknowledge him. At the beginning of this documentary, a mason was shown chiseling a name from a wall at Amarna. That name, and every name like it across Egypt's monuments, was removed on Horemheb's orders. The man who left no stone unturned was also the man who left almost no trace of those who came before him. For approximately 3,000 years, Amarna was exactly what Horemheb intended: forgotten. The name Akhenaten disappeared from official records. The city's mud brick walls eroded into the desert. The Talatat blocks were repurposed or buried. The man who built the city remained nameless in the historical record, referred to, when mentioned at all, only as the criminal. The rediscovery was slow. In 1824, John Gardner Wilkinson visited the site and made the first systematic records of the surviving inscriptions and boundary stellae, the large stone markers Akhenaten had erected at Amarna's borders, defining the city's limits. He correctly identified the ruins as the remains of an 18th dynasty capital. The decipherment of hieroglyphics was still new. The identity of the pharaoh who built Amarna was not yet certain. Flinders Petrie arrived in 1891 and conducted the first excavations, recovering pottery, sculptural fragments, and confirming the city's layout. His work was systematic but preliminary. The major finds were still underground or still unrecognized. Ludwig Borchardt's expedition arrived in 1912. On the 6th of December of that year, his team found a painted limestone bust in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose. The object was transported to Germany. How it was declared at the time, whether its significance was deliberately understated to Egyptian export authorities, remains a live dispute. John Pendlebury conducted the most intensive pre-war excavations through the Egypt Exploration Society between 1930 and 1936. His field guide to the site remained a standard reference for decades. He was killed in May 1941 during the Battle of Crete, fighting with British forces, his work at Amarna unfinished. The tomb designated Kfi 55, discovered in the Valley of the Kings in 1907, contained a damaged coffin and funerary equipment from the Amarna period. The excavation was poorly documented. Objects were moved before proper recording, and the identity of the body has been contested ever since. The genetic evidence points to Akhenaten. The question is still technically open. What turned Akhenaten from an archaeological subject into a cultural figure was Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's intact tomb in November 1922. The global attention that followed, the largest media event in the history of archaeology at that point, drew scholars and public alike back to the Amarna period. Tutankhamun was Akhenaten's son. The Amarna period was suddenly the backstory of the most famous discovery in the history of Egyptology. The American historian James Henry Breasted had already, in 1912, called Akhenaten the first individual in history, the first person in the historical record to assert a singular personal vision against the weight of millennia of institutional tradition. The phrase stuck. The Pharaoh Horemheb had erased from every king list, became the most studied ruler in Egyptian history. In 1939, Sigmund Freud published Moses and Monotheism. His argument was that Moses was not a Hebrew, but an Egyptian, an aristocrat or official who had been a follower of Akhenaten's Aten religion. When the revolution failed and Atenism was suppressed, Freud proposed, Moses gathered a following among Hebrew slaves in Egypt and led them out of the country, carrying the Atenist theology with him in a new form. That theology, Freud argued, became the foundation of Israelite monotheism. Freud acknowledged the claim was speculative. He wrote the book in exile from Nazi Vienna at the age of 83. It was his last major work. The archaeological case against it is specific. There is no Egyptian record of a mass departure of slaves from Egypt at any point in the New Kingdom period. The geography and populations described in the Exodus narrative do not match the known Egyptian record. The Meneptah stele, dated to approximately 1208 BC, places a people called Israel already in Canaan, more than a century after Akhenaten's death. Even the most generous proposed dates for an historical exodus put it well after the period of Atenism. The genealogical connection Freud proposed, Akhenaten's theology directly producing Mosaic monotheism, has no supporting evidence and substantial chronological problems. What the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann did in Moses the Egyptian, 1997, was disengage the historical question from the intellectual one. Assmann was not arguing that Freud was right. He was asking a different question. What kind of idea appears for the first time with Akhenaten? His answer was the concept he called counter-religion. Most ancient religious systems were inclusive, different gods, different traditions, different peoples, all coexisting. Egyptian religion, Mesopotamian religion, Greek religion, all assumed that other gods existed elsewhere, and that religious traditions could be layered and combined. Atenism, under Akhenaten, was the first documented instance of a theology built on exclusion, a faith that defined itself by denying all others. Not, the Aten is one of many gods. The Aten is the only god. Everything else is false. That kind of claim, a religion that does not merely assert its own truth, but insists on the falseness of all competing truths, had consequences that ran far beyond ancient Egypt. Whether or not Akhenaten's theology genealogically produced anything in the Israelite tradition is a historical question that remains unsettled. What Assmann argued was that the appearance of counter-religion as a type of claim, with all the consequences that type of claim has had in world history, happened first in Egypt. The connection is not genealogical. It may not need to be. The painted limestone bust of Nefertiti has been in Berlin since 1913. Egypt has requested its return repeatedly and without success. The standard German position is that the object is too fragile to travel and is correctly housed at the Neues Museum. The underlying dispute is older. At the 1912 Division of Fines, Ludwig Borchardt described the object to Egyptian authorities as a painted plaster bust of a princess, a characterization that significantly understated what his team had found. The Egyptian inspector present reportedly did not see the bust before the allocation was decided. Whether that constituted deliberate misrepresentation is contested. The bust remains in Berlin. In 2015, the archaeologist Nicholas Reeves published an analysis of high-resolution scans of Tutankhamun's tomb. He argued that linear features in the north wall indicated a sealed chamber, possibly, he suggested, the original burial of Nefertiti, interred before her remains were moved. The theory was taken seriously by serious people. Ground-penetrating radar surveys followed. In 2018, a team from the Politecnico di Torino completed an independent survey and declared there were no hidden chambers. Their report used the phrase, "conclusive evidence of non-existence," an unusually strong formulation for a negative result in archaeology. Reeves contested the findings. The mainstream view is that the chambers do not exist. The genetic identification of the KV-55 mummy as Akhenaten has not been independently replicated. The original samples are not publicly available for external analysis. The identification is accepted by most Egyptologists. It has not been confirmed by a second study. Akhenaten's physical remains are technically unconfirmed. In 1984, the composer Philip Glass premiered his opera Akhenaten in Stuttgart. It is sung in ancient Egyptian, Akkadian, and Hebrew. The final scene is performed in English, in the present tense, by an ensemble representing tourists visiting the ruins of Amarna. The man who banned all gods, except one, became the subject of a contemporary art form that draws simultaneously on Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Israelite traditions, three of the cultures his theology tried to define itself against. Akhenaten has been dead for approximately 3,340 years. In that time, he has been erased by a general, rediscovered by archaeologists, theorized about by Freud, reframed by a German Egyptologist, and set to music by an American composer. The questions he generates about monotheism, power, art, identity, and the mechanics of erasure remain open. The figure who has generated those questions has not provided the answers. That may be the point. By every measure, they won. Amun came back. Osiris came back. The afterlife came back. The priests whose income Akhenaten had diverted were reinstated. The temples whose walls his masons had chiseled were restored. The gods he had banned were returned to their shrines and declared to have never truly left. The king lists were rewritten. The city was abandoned. The name was replaced with silence. They won. And the revolution lasted 17 years. So why does every Egyptologist know his name? The question is not rhetorical. It has a structural answer. Systems can suppress a challenge. What they cannot do is unask the question the challenge forced them to face. Horemheb could chisel every cartouche. He could not chisel the fact that a pharaoh had looked at 3,000 years of accumulated theology and said, "This is wrong." The statement was suppressed. The act of having made it was not. This is not unique to Akhenaten. Every institution that has existed long enough has encountered the figure who looked at its foundations and said, "This is wrong." The institution always wins in the end. It has the army, the king list, the priesthood, the money. The challenger is erased, demoted, exiled, or simply outlasted. The system continues. But the system does not continue unchanged. It continues with the memory, however suppressed, of the question it was forced to face. The question does not require a living challenger to remain active. It only requires that the answer given was insufficient. Horemheb's answer, erasure, was the most complete answer available to him. It was insufficient, not because it failed to remove the name. It did remove the name. It was insufficient because it did not resolve the question. 3,000 years later, Egyptologists are still working on the question. The name turned out to be the least important part. The final image from this period is not a king. When the Akhenaten temple project dismantled sections of Horemheb's pylons at Karnak in the 1960s and 1970s, they found thousands of Talatat blocks still bearing their original painted decorations. Among the recovered images are the hands of figures in temple scenes, priests, offering bearers, the small human details that fill the margins of large ceremonial reliefs. These hands were painted by artisans working in Amarna in approximately 1345 BC. The artisans were not named. They are not in the king lists. They are not in Horemheb's Damnatio Memoriae, because they were never important enough to erase. Their work was sealed inside a pylon wall in 1330 BC. It was found, intact, in 1970. The paint was still there. Akhenaten built a city in 17 years. He imposed a theology that lasted as long as he did. He dismantled the richest religious institution in Egypt and rebuilt the state around a single solar disk. He created some of the most technically innovative art of the ancient world. And then he died. The city eroded. The name was chiseled out. The cartouches were recarved. The theology was reversed. The priests came back. And somewhere inside the wall that replaced the temple, the hand of an anonymous Amarna painter was sealed away in the dark, in paint that no one had touched for 33 centuries, in colors that had not faded because they had never been exposed to light. The system won every battle it knew how to fight. You can only bury what you cannot erase, and if you bury it carefully enough, the colors stay.